Welcome to Talk of the Bay, KSQD's local talk program brought to you every weekday at 5 p.m. I'm your host, Suki Wessling, and today I welcome back three guests who visited almost exactly 2 years ago, or perhaps a lifetime ago, given everything that has happened. And no, we're not talking politics or COVID today. We are talking water, which, of course, affects us all. We were deep into a drought 2 years ago, facing a summer of water shortage. Months before the county had been devastated by the CZU lightning complex fires, and we were worried about a repeat of that devastation in 2021. The possibility of devastating rains didn't enter our conversation, but here we are in 2023, and our conversation will be different, yet so much the same. I would like to welcome three people who have made this coast, the Central Coast water, their careers. Sierra Ryan is County of Santa Cruz Water Resources Program Manager, and she oversees the Water Resources Program at the County of Santa Cruz, which covers programs such as the fisheries monitoring, streamwood evaluations, groundwater management, drought response. I think she's got a pretty big portfolio here. Water quality monitoring, drinking water regulations for small water systems, and regional collaboration. Welcome, Sierra. And here in the studio, I have Michael Cahn, who is an Irrigation and Water Resources Farm Advisor responsible for research and education on water quality and quantity issues related to agriculture in Monterey, San Benito, and Santa Cruz counties. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
And finally, also in the studio, Brian Lockwood is General Manager of the Pajaro Valley Water Management Agency, where he has worked for the last 18 years. He is a professional geologist and certified hydrogeologist in the state of California. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you for having me.
And so what I'd like to do, so as you all listening might have noticed, is that we have quite a range of experience here because water is so complex. And the more I learn about it, the more I realize that I have more to learn about it. So you all three have different areas of expertise. You come at it from a different, even a different regional perspective. And so I want to just sort of get a general sense of where we are, where we've been, and how we got where we are, and what has changed, if anything, after our crazy winter of more rain than anyone ever imagined was going to come. So what I'd love to do is start with a quick round so that you can summarize the effects of this rather unusual winter that we just experienced. Sierra called it the weather whiplash in an email to me, I think. And then we'll delve deeper into the issues facing us. So, Michael, we want to start us off?
Well, I can give you maybe an agricultural perspective.
All right, go for it.
Monterey County, I would say, I think the estimate is 20,000 acres were damaged through the floods. And I've seen some of the videos of planes flying over Monterey County during the January as well as the March flood. And I thought January was pretty bad in terms of the number of levees that was affected, but March really took out a lot of levees, and we have whole ranches that are damaged, huge losses, and then of course on the Pajaro side of Monterey County, there were strawberry fields completely under, and I've noticed a lot of them they gave up. They plowed them under. So I think the losses total somewhere around $600 million.
Wow.
And, this is a big impact. So we like rain, but obviously it came a little too much at once.
Yes.
And, there's a point where everything was saturated and it all ran off.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so I definitely want to there's a couple things that you said I want to get to as we progress in here. So I'm going to say them now, and hopefully we'll get back to them. One is the question of what happens to farmland when it's flooded, and how it affects the farmers besides, their homes being flooded, but the land itself. And the other one is the question of how this torrential rain differs from the rain that we might prefer to get for a variety of reasons, and what it does for the water situation on the Central Coast. So, Brian, I'm going to turn to you, and again, sort of a summary of effects from your point of view at PV Water and this unusual winter we had.
Sure, and the flooding aside, we got to keep in mind that while a lot of farmland was damaged, the entire town of Pajaro was evacuated, and there were mandatory evacuations in Santa Cruz County around the New Year's Eve storms. But from the perspective of groundwater resources, there's long-term trends and then short-term events. And so over the course of decades, we've been in a state of overdraft, meaning continuing to pump more water out of the groundwater basin than replenishes year by year. That's led to lowering of groundwater levels and other negative effects like seawater intrusion and groundwater quality degradation. A year like this one, though, does have benefits. It allows us to store extra water in the groundwater basin, and that's really beneficial. We've seen water levels come up on median about 4 feet from spring of last year to spring of this year. But it doesn't change our critical overdraft situation. It's just a step in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. And there have been, one of the things that I wanted to talk about is the projects that are either completed or in the process of happening to replenish the water basin in Pajaro Valley. So let's make sure to get to that. And Sierra, could you give us, from your perspective, a little summary of the effect of this winter on the water situation?
I'd be happy to. So when you first phrased this, you asked what has changed after this winter, and in some ways, quite a bit, and in some ways, nothing at all. So things that changed. A year ago, we were looking at dismally low stream flows and a situation that we were really worried about the devastating impacts on threatened and endangered species throughout the county. We do have endangered coho salmon and threatened steelhead that we are working very hard to protect, both at the county and at the regional level. And this year, we're seeing very high flows. We haven't gotten the fish monitoring yet. They are just about to start doing that work. But we're very hopeful that we're going to see a very good year in that respect. So in some ways, it's been good to see water coming in maybe not in the amount that we have, but the first time we've had substantial rain in a while. Loch Lomond Reservoir filled and spilled for the first time in several years, and that was good news. It had been at pretty low levels going into the dry season last year. And in some ways, like I said, nothing has changed. This hasn't changed anybody's long-term plans for the need for diversifying water supply projects. It's, if anything, only exemplified what we've known was going to be the case for a long time, that California is heading towards a new normal with greater extremes of more intense drought followed by more intense rain, and that we need to make sure that we're prepared for all of those circumstances. So during the drought, it's easy to get really distracted by just what can we do during a lack of water. But I think it's helpful to see it more holistically, and what can we do in the cyclical nature of greater highs and lows of rain events throughout longer time periods.
Mm-hmm. So you deal of the three of you deal with consumers, individual household consumers, as well as agriculture and infrastructure and everything else. And I know that there's this effect that happens whenever the governor, whoever the governor happens to be at that time, says the drought is over. Does it concern you that we have these sort of proclamations? Because is the drought over because we got a huge amount of water this year?
To the governor's credit, he has been a little bit less verbose and enthusiastic about declaring a drought to be over. He's changed his proclamations and executive orders on water management, stating basically that for the time being, the state's surface water resources are in good shape for this year. But he has not changed the way groundwater is being managed. During the peak of the drought, he required additional review for things like new well permits. And it's created partnerships between counties and groundwater sustainability agencies, which are in place to manage groundwater. And that when it was initially required, the language stated that this was going to stay in place until it was revoked at the end of the drought. But even recently, he has decided to keep certain regulations regarding groundwater, because while we might have surface water this year, it took us a lot longer to create the groundwater challenges that we are facing. It didn't happen over a couple of years. It happened over decades. Mm-hmm. It's going to take us decades to reverse those damages and to create sustainability. And so while the surface water might be in good condition this year, it doesn't mean that the quote unquote drought is over.
Yeah. And I mean, it's just such an interesting psychological thing. It's like we have a good winter and people sort of, do a big sigh of relief and start watering their lawns again. And it's hard, even if you're really knowledgeable about it, it's hard not to feel relieved, of course, because it was a relief that we got not just enough water, but my personal favorite is the little late spring rain that we got that made my garden so incredibly happy. Everything is blooming and still very green and happy. So there's a psychological component to, I guess, to living in California that I feel like maybe we need to change even a cultural perspective on our water, which is, in a good year, it's not like we can just go out and spend it the way we would if we got, a big tax rebate. So I wanted to ask all of you have mentioned the aquifers and the fact that we've been overdrawing those for years. And so I'm just going to ask for a volunteer here to explain the science behind that. How do we know how full or empty they are? And do we have estimates for what it would take to get them back to where they should be?
This is Brian.
Okay.
We know the conditions of the aquifers because we can measure it through wells. There's many wells punctuated into the ground all throughout Santa Cruz County. In the Pajaro Valley alone, we know of over 2,000 wells, for instance. And our staff monitor about 200 of those wells, some of which we monitor every month, some we monitor twice a year in the spring and in the fall. And you can send something as simple as a long tape measure down into the well to see how deep the water is. Some wells have oil, so you can get down into the oil and back. And when you track water levels in a well over time, you see them come up in the spring and go down in the fall, and it becomes cyclic in nature. Mm-hmm. And when you do that over the course of decades, then you can see patterns if over the course of years the water levels tend to be trending up or trending down. We also have monitoring wells that you can install, and you can put them so you can collect data from any particular aquifer of interest. And so we look at several different aquifers within the Pajaro Valley. And then to figure out what do we need to do to replenish them, oftentimes water resource managers will rely on hydrologic models to tell you about changing conditions through time. So we build these models, and they're essentially mathematical tools, but they do a good job at mimicking the past, and then you can use them to simulate future conditions. And so you can do things like plug in what would climate change impacts look like, or what if everybody were to reduce pumping or water use by, say, 5 or 10% across the board? What if we were to build water supply projects to provide water sources in certain areas and turn off wells in those areas? How would that affect our problems? So by measuring water levels around the valley, and also looking at stream flows, and where there's coarser grain materials, you get more infiltration, more recharge into the groundwater basin. We can see how we're doing, and we can figure out what do we need to do to sort of get to a spot that would be considered sustainable. Mm-hmm. And every groundwater basin in the state has gone through, or most of them at least, have gone through a process to define what sustainability means for them. and then you track progress towards those sustainability goals through time.
Mm-hmm. And so, Michael, when we get rains like the rains we got, what is the problem? What kind of rains would we rather get, and what happens when we get these torrential rains, and how can we, thinking about climate change and the fact that this might be our new normal, drought or deluge, what can we do to deal with that?
Mm-hmm. Well, from a farmer's perspective, because we're producing vegetables year-round practically, they'd like all the rain in December, essentially, and then no rain afterwards. That would be ideal for them if we got the right amount,
Yeah.
Because then they can get in their fields, they can plant, they do everything. But other than that, they would like, maybe light rains every few weeks as you go through the winter, and have some breaks where they can get in the fields and plant. Right now, all the crops are about 2 weeks behind just because of the colder conditions. So you'll see in the supermarket, all the produce is pretty expensive. Mm-hmm. Also, a lot of fields didn't get planted because it was too wet.
Yeah.
Flooded fields, they can't, if they were previously flooded, they have to wait at least 30 days, sometimes 60 days before they can get in. And
why is that?
That is for food safety reasons,
okay.
Right? So 30 days with testing, or 60 days without any testing.
Mm-hmm.
That's to assure that there's no foodborne pathogens that would, potentially be harmful
mm-hmm.
to us mm-hmm. as consumers. And then your question about, what can we do to make use of these years where we have a lot more rainfall? As Brian was talking about, is we need to get a lot of that water into the aquifer. And about 5% of the land is cover cropped in, say, the Salinas Valley and the Pajaro Valley. And so a lot of that rainfall, once the soil is saturated, it runs off, and there's one of the sources of our flooding. Mm-hmm. So we'd like to get types of systems in place where we can infiltrate a lot more of that rainfall instead of having it run off the fields. Mm-hmm. So I think, one of the things I do is, besides education, I do research. And so we're looking at cover crop systems that might work with the growers in terms of allowing them to get in their fields to plant in the spring, at the same time helping them infiltrate more of that rainfall into the ground.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So there are certain crops that they could plant that would help the water.
Yeah. So the problem with cover crops is they can get in the way of planting. Uh-huh. And so a lot of the growers in the fall, they set up their fields all set to plant, but they're bare. Mm-hmm. So what we want are cover crops that essentially die before they need to plant. And so we're going to be looking into some cover crop or some plant material that's more suited for tropical or semi-tropical areas. And when it gets cold, it will die. So we'll plant it in the fall, uh-huh. get enough biomass to cover the soil, mm-hmm. and then when we get our first freeze, it will die. So we're going to use sorghum, Sudan grass, and Sudan grass as a cover crop, and take a look at that. And that can be planted right in, the beds and everything.
Mm-hmm. We have to take a short break, but when we come back, I can see that Brian is itching to talk about that. You are listening to Talk of the Bay, and we will be right back with more talk about local water. But first, I have a couple of announcements. So welcome back to Talk of the Bay. I am speaking about water with three people who have oodles of experience in this area. Sierra Ryan is the County of Santa Cruz Water Resources Program Manager. Michael Cahn is an irrigation and water resources farm advisor, and Brian Lockwood is general manager of the Pajaro Valley Water Management Agency. And so, Brian, I know you wanted to say something before we had our little break there. Maybe you can summarize what Michael was saying and what you wanted to respond to that.
Absolutely.
Oop.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that. And after the break, looking around at all the squid in the room makes me feel a little bit like I'm underwater. It's kind of neat here. I just wanted to say, I think the work that Michael was just talking about, cover cropping, is really important, and not only for helping to get more water in the ground, but also improving the quality of the water that goes back in the ground and for soil health overall. Removing nitrate out of runoff is really important, and I understand that some of the cover crops can help to do that. Your initial question was about what's the right amount of rainfall, and Michael's answer in the beginning was about if you're a farmer, you want all your rain in December so it doesn't affect your crops later on. I think if we're talking about groundwater recharge and we're not thinking about farming as much, the right amount of rainfall is essentially how much rain it takes to saturate your soil and allow it to, once you get saturated, then you can have deep infiltration, deep percolation of water to recharge the basin. After it's saturated, then you're going to start to get a lot of runoff, and that water will eventually get to the creeks. So if we could have enough rain, turn that knob so it rains, the soil gets saturated, and then after a little while when runoff is happening to fill the streams, we turn it off, and then let the ground dry out a little bit, and then we bring another storm in to re-saturate the soil and then reconnect and have more recharge that way.
So we'll just have to talk to the meteorologists about this. They've been more into drama than they should be, I think. So we want complete lack of drama. We want long stretches of dreary, drizzly days, and exactly what everyone is always hoping we don't have for our physical comfort. But I wanted to ask you, Brian, because you mentioned something I hadn't heard about. In your email to me, the College Lake Integrated Resources Management Project. Can you talk about that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So the Pajaro Valley Groundwater Basin is considered a critically overdrafted basin, which means we've been overdrafting for decades. And the Water Management Agency has various projects and programs in place to help to mitigate that problem and work to achieve sustainability. We recycle wastewater and can treat it to the point where we put it back on crops. We have infiltration basins to capture rainfall runoff and have it percolate into the ground. And we are now constructing the College Lake project, for short, which is going to capture stormwater runoff that fills within the College Lake Basin. College Lake is located adjacent to the Santa Cruz County Fairgrounds. And we're going to store water in that lake and then treat it and send it via pipeline to our existing network of pipes that we use to send water. We deliver water for the purchase of growers who then use our water to continue to keep their crops in production while reducing the amount of water they need to pump out of the groundwater basin. And you might be thinking that draining a lake is a terrible thing, but there's a reclamation district that's been draining the College Lake Basin for about 115 years now. And the reclamation district would drain it so the property owners could then farm their land and bring it into agricultural production. So we're going to continue that same process, but instead of just pumping the water into the creek and out into the ocean ultimately, we're going to store the water, treat it, put it into our pipeline, and then it's going to help to keep agriculture in production while reducing groundwater pumping. So it's going to help us achieve sustainable resources in that way.
And the last time you were here, I was really interested in the whole idea of treating water and sending it back to farms. And it sounds like you have pretty enthusiastic buy-in to that.
It's become a very reliable supply. Our recycled water facility is very relied on by the growers within the area. And then we also have the Harkin Slough project, which is a diversion off of Harkin Slough, just upstream of the Pajaro River, where we take the wintertime flows and we put it into an infiltration basin. And then we have got a network of wells around the basin that can extract the water year-round. So we don't have a large above ground reservoir, but we use the subsurface, the shallow aquifers, as a reservoir to store winter runoff and then extract it throughout the year.
That's great.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I said it's very good because we were talking earlier about how much rainfall the state has had, and if you think about all the snow that's been in the news a lot, that might lead to flooding in the Central Valley. along the Central Coast, we're not connected to any of the large state or federal water supply projects. So the snow runoff that's going to occur, it's not going to cause flooding in central California, here in the coastal area. And we don't get straws to those large reservoirs. So we have to figure out how to use our own local resources responsibly and sustainably.
Yeah, and I wanted to bring Sierra into this because I know that one of the things that was quite contentious, but it's moving ahead is the Pure Water SoCal project and other projects. Can you describe some of the things that are being done to help people in the northern part of the county get water and sustain our water system here?
Yes, my pleasure. Yeah, we can start. Let's start with sort of the Mid-County area. So the Mid-County groundwater basin is another critically overdrafted groundwater basin at risk and already experiencing seawater intrusion like its neighbor in Pajaro. In order to figure out how to not only prevent further seawater intrusion, but also potentially reverse past problems and prepare for the changing climate we know we're experiencing, the largest pumper of that basin, which is SoCal Creek Water District, took the initiative to develop a water purification plant that will treat 1,500 acre feet, which is a significant amount of the deficit. I'm sorry to use terms like acre feet that people might not be familiar with, but
well, you can always relate you can relate it to something that people might be familiar with, but it sounds like a lot.
It's about 326,000 gallons, or about the amount of water that fills one football field 1 foot deep. It's a little bit hard to picture, but I think understanding that it's going to solve a significant amount of the overdraft problem. They'll be purifying water that's originating at the City of Santa Cruz wastewater treatment plant, but it's already been treated at the plant and will be delivered via some underground pipelines, which some of you who might have experienced some traffic in the Santa Cruz and Mid-County area might be familiar with, to a plant over on Chanticleer, which is under construction right now. And it is truly a spectacular project that they are doing. It's the intention will be to purify the water and then send it to a series of injection wells. So similar to the way Brian was describing using the groundwater aquifers as a below ground reservoir, that's the same concept that they're using in the Mid-County basin. They're purifying the water so that it meets and exceeds drinking water standards. It will be injected into the groundwater basin, and there it will be create a barrier against seawater intrusion by raising the levels of the groundwater above the levels of seawater, and it would potentially be available for extraction for use as well. It's really truly an exceptional project and one of the biggest the biggest potable water supply project that's been implemented in Santa Cruz County since Lockwood Reservoir was built. In addition to that, if I can continue with some of the other projects happening, the City of Santa Cruz Water Department is doing another really interesting style of groundwater augmentation through what's called aquifer storage and recovery. So they're taking treated surface water. So the City of Santa Cruz relies mainly on water from the San Lorenzo River, from a series of North Coast streams, and from Loch Lomond Reservoir. Those three sources are surface water and provide 95% of the water that they provide to their customers, which are about 100,000 people. The 5% remaining comes from the Live Oak area from a series of wells called the Belts Wells. So they're going to be taking treated surface water from the San Lorenzo and potentially Loch Lomond and their other sources, treating it and injecting it into the groundwater aquifers near and around their Belts Well system. So it's another way of saving surface water. So rather than saving the water in an above ground reservoir where you have a number of challenges such as impact to habitat and concerns over geological, the potential for earthquakes and fault lines. Instead, they're storing it underground where it has a much less impact and then can be taken out when it's needed to serve the customers. So a lot of really exciting work being done by the city. And one other project that's going to be underway soon is actually a pipeline from the city of Santa Cruz service area to the city of Scotts Valley, or the Scotts Valley Water District, that could potentially allow for water to be moved around when one organization needs it and the other has it. And that can really help offset some impacts from overpumping as well.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I find heartening is when you talk about how different agencies in the county use water, you also talk about how they share water and how because, as Brian said, we're cut off from the rest of the state as far as our water supply goes. We're all in it together, pretty literally.
Yes,
here.
Absolutely. I think, especially having observed some of the challenges that we've seen throughout other parts of the state and really the West as a whole with managing water, it makes me feel very fortunate that in Santa Cruz County, there's a lot of respect between the different water agencies. There's a lot of collaboration and there's a really strong understanding that we really are all in this together. No one else is going to come out and save us. So our only hope is really to partner and think about what would be the most pragmatic way to manage water in this area, and how can we make that happen despite the fact that it is being managed by different agencies.
Mm-hmm. Different agencies with different constituencies and different needs. And I wanted to bounce this now to Michael to talk about a little bit about the research and maybe a little bit about the balance that has to happen. I know that a lot of people that I talk to have a mistaken idea that growers just really aren't interested in saving water, that they just, it's cheap and they just dump it all over the place. And that's not what I hear from people who actually work with growers. So, what is the actual situation? What is the sort of research that you're doing?
Well, we're doing both research and outreach with growers. And I would say growers are interested in conserving water because they realize their land is worthless without a water source. So in the long term, they're very interested. Implementing that is challenging. We have a shortage of labor. Growers are price takers, so they don't have a lot of extra money for doing water management. But, through a conservation program that's partially sponsored by Pajaro Valley Water Management Agency, I've worked with the RCD of Santa Cruz County to help implement, various practices in improving irrigation management. And so we have a nice team. We do one-on-one work with the growers, assessing their irrigation system or their scheduling of irrigations, and slowly we're making progress in improving water management and conservation. Mm-hmm. So in the research area, we've been asking the question, well, how much water does lettuce need or celery need or broccoli need realistically?
Yeah, I saw that on your website. This is all broken down in very, very specific ways. And you have workshops for people growing these different crops.
Right. That's correct. And we've developed actual models based on weather information, so we can tell a grower exactly how much water their celery or broccoli or cauliflower needs at any date. And there's software online that they can use to access that information. And they can access it actually from their smartphone. And so part of what we do is develop those models, do research, do validation of them, and also outreach to teach growers, the irrigators, the farm managers on how to utilize them. And hopefully, with time, they'll get more efficient. And then one other aspect is making irrigation technology work for them. So drip irrigation, a lot of growers have it, but they don't optimize it. And there's design issues, maintenance issues. So if we can work with them and show them how to use drip better or use sprinklers better, we can, again, increase water conservation.
And what are some of the crops that are commonly grown in the Central Coast that are particularly water thirsty that you are, hoping to focus on and help the growers not use quite as much water?
Well, I would say any of the cool season vegetables, they do very well with lots of water. And so there's no real negative effect of over irrigating. So whether we're working with lettuce or broccoli or cauliflower or celery, those are all crops that we usually have potential to reduce the amount of water, especially in the establishment of those crops. If we're just seeding or putting transplants in, often too much water is applied right in the beginning. Later on, most of the growers are pretty good, but in the beginning of the establishment, we often see over irrigation happening.
Yeah, I know that I always thought that I was sort of miserly with water, and then I actually started measuring, how moist the soil was, and found it's like, oh, I don't need to water that yet. And if you really pay attention, you can find out that there's things that you can overwater. They seem fine, but they don't need all that water. So it's a good way to conserve without actually having any negative side effect there. So I want to take another break. You are listening to Talk of the Bay. We will be back in just a moment to talk more about water policy on the Central Coast. We are talking about water policy on the Central Coast with three people. We have Sierra Ryan online, who is the County of Santa Cruz Water Resources Program Manager. And in the studio, we have Michael Cahn, who is an Irrigation and Water Resources Farm Advisor and researcher. And Brian Lockwood is the General Manager of the Pajaro Valley Water Management Agency. So we are talking the whole breadth of water policy and water, where we are with water. And Sierra, I know that one thing that, obviously everyone is aware of and particularly concerned about when it comes to water is climate change, and how we prepare for climate change, and how can we prepare for something when we really aren't quite sure. I mean, especially I'm going to bring up, the poor meteorologists. I'm being very mean to them today, but they said that this winter was going to be exceedingly dry, round about November, early December, and they were a little wrong. So how are we going to do planning for climate change? What are some things that your team is working on?
Well, the first thing we do is we are looking at long-term climate models, and there are a number of different models out there that are used by different water agencies and the groundwater sustainability agencies. And while they are all different, and none of them can predict what's going to happen next year, say, or any specific year in general, they do all have a very similar trend, which is an overall increase in variability, which is that whiplash weather effect. So more intense dry periods and more sporadic but exceedingly wet periods. It's interesting because they don't all agree on whether the overall amount of rain we're going to get is going to be the same or potentially a little less. But it's really more about how we get that rain, as Michael was talking about earlier. That's really equally as important as the amount of rain that we get in terms of our ability to capture it and use it in a way that is beneficial. So understanding that increased variability is really the direction of the future. That's what we are planning for. And so we are trying to take into account who is going to need help in the long run and how can they be helped. And I should say that every single water agency in the county is looking at this, and they're looking hard. I already named some of the projects going into place. There's more work being done even by, I didn't even mention what the San Lorenzo Valley Water District is doing with their efforts. So on the one hand, for water supply, for the municipal customers, the projects really are the likely solution, and the projects are there to offset the likely impacts of climate change. Now, what's a little bit harder are the 8,000 or so households in the county that rely on domestic wells for their water use. They're not connected to one of these water agencies. And so these large projects aren't really going to benefit them directly, although in some cases, if groundwater elevations are being increased by a project, that will benefit someone who's got a private well tapped into that same aquifer. But a lot of the private wells are shallower. They're not as deep as the big municipal water supply wells are. So for them, the county is really starting to work on what is the safety net for these folks if it's dry and their water supply diminishes, if their well runs dry, for example. What services can we offer? What services can we leverage from the state to help folks? And we're actually in the process of unrolling our drought response program, which the website is not quite ready yet, but it will be ready very soon.
Okay.
That will outline some services that we will be offering to, say, folks on private wells in terms of water hauling. So if a well runs dry, we can actually have water hauled from a water supply agency to a private well to fill up their tanks while they're working on getting a new well drilled. And then some long-term looking at the possibility of consolidating smaller systems with larger ones, or individuals with larger systems where there's just a little bit more resiliency and redundancy in water supply.
Yeah, I know that there was a lot of news about what happened, and it was in Mendocino, right, where they literally almost ran out of water.
It's happened in a lot of places, and a lot of communities have been hit harder than Santa Cruz County has already from the impacts of drought and overuse of water resources.
And as far as planning goes, do you feel like one of the things that's a very, very big issue in this county that sort of runs not counter to water use, but in it is related is housing, and that we don't have enough housing, and that there's a lot of housing being built. Do you feel that the various agencies, the cities and the county, are being responsible about the planning as far as the housing goes and how much water the new housing will use?
Yes, and thank you for that question, because that does often come up as almost like an elephant in the room when it comes to water supply. But one thing it's really important for people to understand is that the new housing going in uses much, much less water than, say, an existing 3-bedroom single-family home that was built in the 40s would. These are high-density houses. They usually have a lot of the housing is high density. It has minimal outdoor landscaping, and that's it can be a very significant portion of a household water use portfolio. Any of these new houses being developed are going to be using significantly efficient fixtures. So obviously it's going to have low flow toilets, low flow shower heads, efficient washers if they have washing machines at all. And the per capita water use in these is so low that the negative impacts on the water supply compared to just about any other water use, it's really low, and it to me doesn't in any way outweigh the need for the housing. And to carry on from that, the water supply agencies are using housing numbers when they are planning for their future water supply needs. So these projects are being built with how much water future they're going to need in the future. And with the amount of conservation that we have seen regionally since, say, the 2012 drought began, we're using less water now than we were in 1980. And I mean that regionally, and I'm not exaggerating. The amount of water being used in Santa Cruz County by households on municipal water supply is less now than it was in the early 1980s. And that shows that housing isn't the issue here. Our population has gone up pretty significantly in that time period, and yet our water use is lower now. It peaked in the late 90s and early 2000s and has been going down ever since. And then with this most recent push starting in 2013 to conserve, we're at much lower levels than we've seen before. So I don't want to say that it's not an issue or a concern, because I don't want to, all of these are issues and concerns. But to me, it's a bit of a red herring to make the case that water alone is the reason that we should not have housing. I don't think that is a fair argument, or one that is supported by the data that we have.
Well, that's really good to hear. I really appreciate that you went into that in detail, because, we all want to maintain what we love about this county and improve what we don't love. but there's just a certain point. I know I used to say, oh, we don't need any more housing. Now I'm just like, build the housing, please. We need more housing. So I know I personally have moved over to realizing that although this is, that places do change, and hopefully we can make the positive change, and as you said, not focus on things that really are red herrings in the debate. And, to put this back to farming, one of the things that happened with the floods is that a lot of farmers, not only is their farm their place of business, but it's their home. Do either of you have a sense of how much people are able to get back from what has happened in the most devastated communities? And is there rebuilding going on that's taking into account the fact that flooding is one of the predictions for climate change moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, of course, in the town of Pajaro, there were a lot of farm workers, and so they lost a lot during the floods. Out in the farms, the actual farms, there was equipment hurt, and wells actually hurt, and infrastructure, some farm homes. But I would say, as growers look at their land that's close to rivers and realizing how susceptible it is to flooding, there are growers considering whether they should continue to farm that land, and perhaps it should go back to the river, and in the future, especially where the levees have broken. So I know along the Salinas River, those are some of the thoughts growers have, whether it's just economical even to continue farming those areas. I don't know if you want to.
Sure. And I know there's a massive new project coming to the Pajaro Valley. It's the Pajaro River Flood Management Agency is going to work with the Army Corps of Engineers on a fully funded $400 million project to rebuild the levees to make them stronger, withstand larger floods. And Pajaro Valley Water Management Agency is working closely with the Flood Management Agency. And we actually have a grant proposal into the Department of Conservation. We're looking at ways to set back the levees, particularly on some of those farmlands that Michael was talking about, where growers are thinking maybe it's not worthwhile to continue farming, but maybe there's other benefits. The soil could be very conducive for managed aquifer recharge, or recharge when the water comes up, so we can move the levees further back from the river, protect all the prime farmland, and have more recharge occur when the river floods. It provides greater flood protection and more groundwater recharge. And And as we think to climate change, I think we need to keep doing and enhancing a lot of what we're already doing pretty well. Our collaboration with Michael Cahn and EC Cooperative Extension, our partners at the Resource Conservation District of Santa Cruz, they're going out and working with growers to improve their irrigation methods and use water more efficiently overall. We're funding $100,000 a year right now for free rebates for growers to test new technologies. And these services are being provided by PV Water at no charge to the grower. So it's a benefit to anyone who's out there who's interested in receiving these services. And I think through time, we have some of the most productive farmland in the world in California, and maybe even more so along the Central Coast. So we want to do what we can to maintain that agricultural economy and that community we have here. And we can do it through working collaboratively, bringing in the brightest minds in the field to help continue to keep these crops moving towards production effectively and efficiently.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to mention, because Sierra was talking about how housing has become more water efficient. And, one example for growers is we're growing double the crop, lettuce being an example, double the yields with half the water.
Wow.
Since the 70s. So we're basically using the water 4 times more efficiently now.
Mm-hmm. And, one of the things that strikes me just talking to all of you is the sense of positive, those of us who are reading the national media, there's just all this negative about California and how, you read all these things. And of course, they lump in downtown Los Angeles with Pajaro Valley, with Central Valley. People don't seem to get how diverse this place is, but that there's this real sense of hope. Would you agree that you have this sense of hope that we're really working on and solving problems?
I absolutely. I think we need that hope to go in every day and be optimistic about achieving sustainability in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm very optimistic. We're all very creative, and because we are isolated, as Brian pointed out, from the rest of the state, we've always had the sense that we have to take care of our own problems here and manage our own water resources. And each valley, each basin has different advantages and disadvantages, and we work together to help each other.
All right. And Sierra, you get the last word.
Wow, that's a lot of pressure. I would agree completely. I'm very optimistic about what the future has in store for us.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. We have been speaking about water policy on the Central Coast. And listeners, you can check ksqd.org for a podcast of this show. If you missed any of it, or if you want to go back and hear things that we discussed, I will have links on that episode page. So please do visit our website. You can also subscribe to our stream on major podcasting platforms. Just search for Talk of the Bay KSQD. Thanks for listening, and please return again every weekday at 5 p.m. for more Talk of the Bay.